It's time for us to check back in with Watermelon Hill and see what happens next. If you've missed any of the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist. And if you'd like to buy this wonderful, wonderful book, please visit watermelonhillbook.com. Homemade toys. Children, no matter where they live or how rich or poor they are, instinctively want to play. If they don't have the resources for store-bought toys, they make up for it with ingenuity. We made most of our toys ourselves, or the older kids made them for the younger ones. In the absence of toys, we played games or made our own. Some of them were quite ingenious, and making them was half the fun. There was a wide variety, so I'll save the most unusual for last. There were games from the familiar checkers to the unknown fox and goose. We made checkers from discs sewn from an old broom handle, colored with crayons, paint, or whatever was available. Fox and goose was on a homemade board, since the game itself was homemade. I don't remember how it was played, but the pieces were white and yellow grains of corn. We made a variety of musical instruments, though the sounds they made could only be called music by a very charitable person with a tin ear. The most simple was probably a blade of grass held between the thumbs. We would blow through the grass and it would vibrate, making a kazoo sort of sound. There were flutes made from green branches, usually either pawpaw or hickory, with the bark separated from a section and slid back over a notch cut in the branch. Even a mature green onion with holes cut could produce different notes when covered by the fingers and blown into. Stringed instruments were made using twine or wire. Jack even attempted a fiddle once. The bow was strung with hair from the tail of one of our horses. Makeshift drums were almost anything handy that could produce a noise by beating on them. Empty oatmeal boxes were natural drums. Toys were as simple as a flat piece of wood on a string and swung around to make a buzzing, whirring noise, similar to what Paul Hogan did in the movie Crocodile Dundee 2. Or a large button with a 2-foot length of string doubled through it and looped over a finger of each hand. The button was wound up a few turns, then when you pulled on the strings, centrifugal force would keep it going, reversing each time you pulled the strings. It would make a buzzing sound and just about cut the circulation off in the fingers each time it wound up tight. One of a farm boy's favorite simple toys was an old metal rim from a wagon or buggy wheel. We would take a forked stick to guide them and run all over the place with them. If a metal rim wasn't available, we rolled old tires around and sometimes even got inside the tire while someone rolled us down a hill. Toys were also as complex as toy cars and trucks made from wood, nails, scrap metal, whatever was available. Jack also once made a whole set of farm implements for me to play with in my sand pile. They were great. Tops, or as we called them, whirligigs, were made from one of Mom's empty thread spools. The spool was cut in the middle to make 2 tops. The middle of the spool where it was cut was then tapered down to the center hole. A stick, also tapered on the end and cut to fit the hole, was inserted. The other end of the stick was held between thumb and finger and twirled to make it spin. We would have contests to see whose whirligig would spin the longest or which ones would knock the other off a table. I wonder if kids still make tin can telephones. Probably not, they just buy some walkie-talkies. We had hours of fun making and talking on our phones. Just take 2 tin cans, large ones work best, and poke a hole in the bottom of each with a nail. Connect them with a string or very fine wire, run through the holes and tied to the button inside the can. Connect them with a string or very fine wire, run through the holes and tied to a button inside the can. Speaking in one can sets up a vibration that is carried over the string and sets up the same vibration in the other one and can be heard with your ear to the can. The only thing is that the string cannot touch anything in between the cans or the vibration will be lost. Empty oatmeal boxes also work well, they just don't hold up as long since they are cardboard. Almost every farm boy of that time made a toy windmill at some time or other. I know I made several. Just a stick with a hand-carved propeller on one end and a tail of some sort on the other. mounted on a nail in the middle. It would stay turned into the wind and spin away. The trick was to get everything balanced for it to really work well. A more simple propeller toy was just a stick about 1/2 inch by about 1 foot long with notches cut in it and a propeller on one end. The propeller should be balanced but does not have to be carved to match the wind. It is made to turn by just rubbing another stick over the notches, setting up a vibration. I mentioned in another chapter about making paper airplanes, but if I could get my hands on some firecrackers, sometimes I would create a mid-air explosion. I would stand on top of a rock cliff, make an extra long fuse, and sail the plane off with a firecracker as cargo. Sometimes the explosion would just leave some confetti to flutter down. Probably lucky I didn't set the woods on fire or blow my fingers off. Unfortunately, not all attempts to make toys were successful. One of my most notable failures was my kite. At the time, I had never seen a kite in person, but I had seen pictures. All I knew was that it was roughly diamond-shaped and had a tail. I had no idea how heavy the kite or the tail were supposed to be. Mom and Dad didn't have a clue how to make a kite either, and all the older kids had already left home, so I was on my own, but I wanted to fly a kite. I split some strips out of some old wood laths, got some old wrapping paper, and I was ready to begin. My greatest mistake was not knowing that the 4 sides of a kite were supposed to be made from string. I made the 4 sides and the cross pieces all out of the wood lath strips. I tied them together, glued the paper onto them, and made the tail from a piece of string about 3 feet long, with small scraps of material tied on it. I tied them together, glued the paper onto them, and made the tail from a piece of string about 3 feet long, with small scraps of material tied on it. The kite must have weighed about 1 pound and the tail less than 1 ounce. Like I said, I didn't have a clue. My Uncle Grant came to visit about the time I got my monstrosity finished, and I asked him if he thought it would be strong enough. He said, "Son, I guess it'll hold together till the cows come home, but you might have a little trouble flying it." I tried flying it, but no matter how strong the wind or how fast I ran with it, it wouldn't even get over 10 feet off the ground. I later made some kites that flew very well after cutting the weight down drastically. Actually, I'm glad my first kite never flew, because if it had, the roof of the house would probably have flown too. It would have taken a small hurricane to get that thing off the ground. Of the several toys weapons we made, the farm boys' universal favorite was a slingshot. Made from a select fork of a small tree limb and powered by 2 strips of inner tube attached to an old leather shoe tongue to hold the rock, it was surprisingly accurate in the right hands. The preferred rubber was from a red inner tube if possible. These were pre-World War II and were real rubber that was much stronger than the black synthetic rubber ones. We got plenty of practice. Our pockets were always the first thing to wear out on our pants from carrying ammo, rocks in them. Mom would usually patch or replace them with scrap material saved from other old clothes. We were always making bows and arrows, some just toys, but others made from split hickory logs were quite powerful. The arrows were made from slender, straight branches, sometimes fletched with chicken feathers. Not as accurate as today's equipment, but not bad after a lot of practice. We even had homemade firecrackers, actually almost hand grenades, made by sealing pieces of carbide sprinkled with water in a can. We had to get rid of this one fast because it would explode as soon as the carbide gas expanded enough, and we never knew how long it would take. This was one we didn't tell Mom or Dad about and only did out of earshot of the house. On the lower end of the weapon scale were spitball guns and pop guns made from alder branches. These had a pithy center and were straight. We would poke out the center, carve a plug to fit in one end to use as the firing pin, and insert a spitball in the other. A hard rap on the plug with the heel of the hand would send the missile flying with surprising force. I'm sure even today most kids catch lightning bugs, fireflies, in the summertime. I think that is a timeless activity. I would put them in a jar and keep them in my room that night as a nightlight. I have even smeared them on the propeller of my windmill to make a glowing circle at night when it would spin. A little sick, huh? One of the favorite bug toys was a June bug. They are an iridescent green beetle about 3/4 of an inch long. As the name implies, they were plentiful in Kentucky around June. We would take a length of Mom's fine sewing thread so as not to weight the bug down and tie it onto a back leg. The poor thing would then try to fly away, and we would have our own little airplane. It's hard for me to believe I actually had fun playing with a bug on a string. Marbles was a great game at home or school at lunch hour. Just find a hard-packed patch of clay with no grass on it, not hard to find in eastern Kentucky. Scratch a circle in it and you're ready to play. The only thing to decide was, are we playing for funds or for keeps? If we played for keeps, we sure didn't tell Mom or Dad because it was considered gambling. The most popular game at school, or if we got some neighbor kids together in our pasture field, was the great American pastime, baseball. Occasionally someone would bring a real bat or a real baseball or softball to school, but most of the time they were homemade. The country group Alabama sings about playing baseball using sawmill slabs for bats, and that is just what we used most of the time. We would whittle the handle down so we could get a grip on it, and we had a bat. The balls were usually just string from feed sacks wound into a tight ball. If we were really lucky, someone would come up with a hard rubber ball or an old golf ball for a center, wind string around it, cover it with a wrapping of friction tape, and we had a real ball. I said I was saving the most unusual for last, and here it is. You thought it was the June bug on a string, didn't you? No, it wasn't. Remember when I told you that at hog killing time we used almost the complete hog? Well, part of it was even used for a toy. I've had lots of people doubt the truth of this, but I have seen it documented in pictures and in print books about the settlement of people in Cades Cove in Tennessee in what is now the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. When the hog was butchered, the bladder was removed, washed and dried. It was then inflated, a few dried beans put inside to rattle, and you had a durable ball for kids to play with. When the bladder dried, it was very strong, with a texture like parchment paper. I remember playing with one of these when I was a little kid. Maybe a bug on a string wasn't so bad after all. Canning time. When you live on a farm, there are times of urgency throughout the year. Planting time had to be as early as possible in the spring when danger of frost was past, if the signs were right for the crop being planted. The crops and garden had to be tilled and tended as needed, but the most urgent was harvest time. If the fruit or vegetables were ripe, they had to be taken care of before they became overripe and spoiled. Some things, such as corn or cucumbers, if they went past the optimum time, would be too hard to be usable. It was absolutely unthinkable that we should let anything go to waste, so any other plans we had were adjusted around whatever was ripe and ready to be harvested. We may not have had electricity, indoor plumbing, or nice clothes. We may not have had much selection as far as meat and had many meals without meat at all, not because we were vegetarians, but because we may have been short on meat in the months before hog killing time. But no matter what else was lacking in our life, we always had plenty to eat thanks to our large garden and orchards. Today, when most people want to preserve something, they freeze it. But that was hard to do without a freezer or electricity to run it. So Mom canned things and in some cases dried them. Some beans, including the ones still in the shell, which we called leather britches, peppers, sometimes apples, pumpkins, and squash were dried. But Mom canned most things. She was very proud of her canned goods, and rightly so, and would sometimes give relatives who were visiting from a city a jar or two of some delicacy, which was usually much better than store-bought. When we had visitors, Mom would take them down to the cellar and show off her stock. She told me that back when all the kids were still at home, she sometimes had over 1,000 quarts canned up. She made sure there was plenty to last until the garden came in next year, but not without many long hours of hard work, not just for Mom, but for the whole family. On and off for about 3 or 4 months during the summer and fall, something or other was ready to be canned. We planted beans and corn at 2 or 3 different times, so we would have plenty for the table, and the canning process could be spread out to make it a little easier. Have you ever heard of a worm called a pack saddle? If you had picked much corn at canning time, you would have. They were a little over an inch long, with a saddle-looking mark on the back and stinging horns. They hurt worse than a wasp sting. Mom canned a huge variety of things prepared in different ways. Pickles were dill, sweet sliced, or for young ones, whole and bread and butter, or used in relish, along with sliced green tomatoes and sometimes corn. Corn was whole kernel or cream style. There were canned ripe tomatoes, tomato juice, canned grapes, grape juice, grape jelly, canned sliced apples, apple juice, apple jelly, apple sauce, apple butter. Almost everything had a few varieties, and that meant another job of canning. Canning was quite a production, what with picking, cleaning, slicing, washing jars, etc., just to get ready for the actual canning process. We did not have a pressure cooker, and it would not have been big enough for the volume of canning that Mom did anyway. We canned in a large copper boiler about 2.5 foot long, 16 inches high, and 15 inches wide. That wouldn't work very well on today's stoves, but on top of an old wood burning cook stove, it was perfect. The whole top of the stove got hot, so heat was evenly distributed through the entire boiler. The quart canning jars were stacked too high in the boiler, and the lids put on but not tightened. Then water was put into the boiler and allowed to come to a boil, blanching the contents of the jars so they wouldn't spoil. Mom was undisputedly in control of the entire canning process. Everyone else, including Dad, did whatever she said when she said to do it. When Mom decided they were done enough, the jars were removed from the boiler and the lids were tightened. I'm sure a good hand tightening would have been sufficient to produce a seal, but Mom insisted they be tightened as much as possible with a special tool that gripped the lids. Mom would take charge of the tightening herself while someone else held the jar so it wouldn't turn. The jars were extremely hot, having just come out of a steam bath, so we had to hold them with a cloth to keep them from burning our hands. Once when we were canning applesauce, I was holding the jar as tight as I could because Mom really leaned into it when she tightened the lids, when it suddenly crushed in my hands. It must have had a defect in the glass that had gotten by Mom's inspection, but when it happened, I wasn't nearly as concerned with the cause as I was with the result. I was holding the jar with a dishcloth, but when it burst, my hands went right into it, and the hot applesauce overflowed all over my hands and wrists. I remember yelling and spinning around, slinging applesauce over every surface in the kitchen. It was on the walls, floor, even the ceiling. I got a pretty good burn out of it, but no cuts from the glass. Mom had scars all over her hands and arms from burns around the stove. We didn't have any aloe plants then, but they would have been used regularly if we'd had them. Mom prided herself on her canned goods and hated for any to spoil, which was why she was insistent on the lids being so tight. Before we stored the jars in the cellar, we made sure all of them had a vacuum seal that would prevent spoilage, so they spent the first night in the house. If it was a long day, which it almost always was, there were a lot of jars. They were distributed around the house, usually under the beds to keep them out of the way. The lid was convex on top until it cooled, and then it would pop down to show that it had an airtight seal. They made quite a loud, distinctive pop, and on canning day, you could hear lids popping until well into the night. We all helped with all aspects of canning, including keeping wood hauled into the kitchen to fuel the stove. As you can imagine, the kitchen was very hot in the summer, with a fire burning in the stove all day and the outside temperature sometimes going over 100 degrees. We all suffered in the heat, but Mom had the worst of it, working over the stove most of the day. The stove was at the end of the kitchen near the back door, and there was always a thermometer hanging by the door at the opposite end. I recall that it once read 113 degrees, and I'm sure that wasn't unusual at all. It was probably higher sometimes. Just imagine what it must have been near the stove. The whole house became an oven on cannon days. I honestly don't know how Mom could take it. Favorite places. All over our farm on Watermelon Hill were places that stuck in my memory. The hayfields, the pine grove near the graveyard, the riverbanks, etc. But there were a few places that were special, where I would sometimes go just to spend time and daydream. One was on the border of the Caperton land on the south side of our farm. There was a deep ravine separating the two farms with a small stream running down the bottom of it. The stream originated from springs on Shannon's land and ours. They were in the pasture fields and provided a good watering place for our horses and cows. As the stream left the pasture fields, it continued down into the ravine, which dropped deeper and deeper as it wended its way to the river. Deep in the shadows of the ravine, the little stream dropped over a rock shelf as a waterfall. The rock shelf jutted out, leaving a hollowed-out area underneath it like a cave. This was a great place for all kinds of make-believe adventures, especially when there had been enough rain for the stream to be flowing strong. When I was in the little cave with the water falling down in front of me like a curtain, I could be a caveman, an Indian, a mountain man, anything my imagination could dream up. On the hottest days of summer, this spot was always shady and cool. As this gorge continued to the river, it opened wider and got deeper till it finally fell away on each side to the river banks. At this point, there were high rock cliffs on the corner of our land facing the river and on Caperton's land. The rock cliffs continued all along the riverfront of our farm, but on this particular corner, they had a sheer drop to the river banks below and provided a great view both up and down the river. There were large hardwood trees which provided striking splashes of color when the leaves turned in the fall. In the spring, there were dogwood and redbud trees in bloom. Under the trees, there were wild azaleas and huckleberries, and on the ground and rocks was a thick carpet of lush green moss. Put it all together, and it was a spot where you could easily lose yourself for an hour or two. This place did not lend itself so much to adventure as the cave under the waterfall, but was more of a place for relaxing and thinking. Whenever something was bothering me or I needed to make up my mind about something, more likely than not, this is where I would end up. I might start out just walking aimlessly around the farm, but sooner or later I would end up on the rock cliff, sit down on the moss carpet, watch the river, and think it through. I sometimes wish I could still go there. My family no longer owns the farm, and there are many beautiful homes built on it now. One of them is overlooking my waterfall and cave, but I always thought I would like a home on the rock cliff. So far, no one has built there. Maybe it's just as well, as it would spoil the natural beauty of the place. My other favorite place was on the other side of the farm, bordering Acres and George Riggs' land. Here was another ravine with a small stream leading on down to the river. My spot was upstream before the ravine made its steep drop. The sides had a more gentle slope here and were carved sort of like an amphitheater, with one side open toward the river. This area was forested with huge beech trees with a carpet of leaves under them. There was almost no undergrowth, as the great trees had shaded it all out. It is a little hard to put into words my feelings about this place, but I sort of felt like it was a place where you shouldn't talk too loud, like in a church. Maybe that is what it felt like, a grand cathedral with the great beech trees soaring to the sky, forming a ceiling overhead with their branches. Their massive trunks looked like they couldn't even be shaken by an earthquake. Add the peacefulness of this place to the sound of the stream trickling over the rocks on its way to the river, and it could lull you to sleep. Each of my special places was unique in its own way. You could say they had their own personality, and each was my favorite, depending on my mood on any particular day. I still miss them. So we'll stop right there for today. I enjoyed this part of the book. I've enjoyed all of the book, but I especially liked how Dale started this part talking about the toys. Of course, not all the toys that he talked about are ones from my childhood, but some of them. I remember the buttons he was talking about on the string. We called those zizzer buttons, and I can remember my Mama Marie making one for me. I made them for the girls. They were great fun. Dale didn't mention this part, but one of the deadliest parts about them is if they got close to your hair. If you were a girl with long hair and they got close to your hair wound up very quickly in that string as it was rotating. So it was a danger to girls with hair, or boys if you got it up close to it, but most of the time it was girls that got their hair in it. So I definitely have fond memories of those. And other ones, the slingshot he talked about, I never had a slingshot, but Pap made Steve and Paul lots of slingshots, and he would most often make them out of a hunt through the laurels or the ivy, mountain laurel, rhododendron. To most people, he would hunt through them to find, and that's what a lot of times what he would use to make them. And Dale's right, you could get pretty good with them if you used them all the time. Corey and Katie had slingshots. Matt didn't make them, but when they were little, and they'd just get on the porch and try to shoot stuff off of the porch. I remember one time too when I was really little, and I'm sure Steve had help, but he made these wagons, him and some of my cousins, and they had wheels, wooden wheels, and they would get in them, and you basically have to get in them on a steep hill and just ride down the hill. I don't really remember that they turned that good. Maybe they did have a steering thing. I need to get Steve to tell about them, but I remember those. And of course there was things like paper dolls, and Pap, Daddy, was always involved in building somewhere along the way. He built lots of houses before him and Matt built them for a living, but he helped people in the community, and he helped build our church and the church and different things like that. So there was always a lot of scrap wood around, and I would get some of those scrap wood pieces. Even then, that was really pre-computer. I didn't know nothing about computers, but I was really amazed and obsessed with thinking about buttons, any kind of buttons. So think of adding machines and like cash registers and those kind of things. So I would draw out on like maybe a piece of wood, and I would draw out the numbers so then I could act like I had my own cash register. I'd put Granny's ironing board up and get my board with the numbers on it, and then I'd make Paul come in and act like he was buying something. So it's wonderful to be a kid and have that kind of imagination. I loved baby dolls though. I loved all my dolls, and I liked paper dolls. Okay, anything like that I liked, and I wanted Corey and Katie to like them. They never did really like them, but one time I remember it was kind of cold outside, but they was always playing outside, and I found them. They had something, I couldn't tell what it was, wrapped up in a blanket, and it was a piece of firewood. They went to the wood pile and got a piece of firewood, and that was their doll. And I was like, that was their baby, their log baby they called it. And I was like, you've got a whole room full of dolls. Why would you play with a piece of wood? But that's what they wanted to play with. So that was their imagination there. And I hope kids today, some of them at least, still have those kind of imaginations. I know today so many kids have technology, and of course toys are so, there's just so many toys. There was so many toys when I was a child compared to Dale, but even now compared to when I was a child, it's just so drastically different. But I hope that kids still get to do that. And then he was talking about the June bug. We did that too when we were young with the June bugs. Whoever, older cousin or uncle or Mama or Papa or whoever taught us to do that, and we would do that and let them fly around. And of course the lightning bugs. We would do the same thing, catch them and then let them light up your room and then turn them loose in the morning. Most of the time is what we did, and Corey and Katie did that too. One day last week, or maybe the week before, my days have all run together, but we were at Miss Cindy's house when she was sick and she was resting, and we were all sitting on her little porch and kind of just sitting there, and I was looking off down by the creek, and I began to see the lightning bugs, and it's just a homey feeling. It made me want to go try to catch some of them, but I didn't. And then the marbles was another common one that Dale was talking about. Lots of people his age and maybe in between mine and his age have those memories of marbles. I never played marbles, but my older brother Steve, he went through a spell of where he played marbles at school. The older boys did. I don't really remember nobody in my class doing it, but maybe they did. But I loved the marbles. Not that I wanted to play with them, just all the beautiful colors, those swirly, different ones, clear ones that you can see the swoosh through, and then the white ones, and all the different ones. I loved them. I was always infatuated with marbles. It's one of my favorite things. Sometimes we get to hunt at old home places, and if that's like one of the common things that we'll find is a marble. I still like how they look and still like to hold them in my hand, especially those, and think about who held them before me. I need to ask Steve if he kept all his marbles or what he did with them. And then the part about Dale's mother canning all the food. Could you imagine? I can food every year for my family, but I'm not canning no 1,000 cans like his mother did. Could you just imagine? And today that would be way easier for me to do than it was for her to do. When you think about just the heat, like Dale said, I can do it in air conditioning. We mostly can on our porch, but still we can step right back inside while the pressure canner's going. But the heat, and then just that amount of work, hauling the water, hauling the wood, just tremendous amount of work. But in those days, they had to do that to eat. I could still go to the grocery store today. I love to can and preserve the bounty from my garden to feed my family and to eat for me because it's so good, but I could still go to the grocery store, so I don't have that, what as they say, the wolf's not howling at my door. So, but that was amazing, and I really liked how Dale said that his mother was in charge, and how it sounded like she had her own way of doing things, like how she tightened the lids afterwards. That part reminded me of Granny, not that she does that, but just that she has her way of doing things, and that's how she does them, and you're going to do them the way Granny does it if you help her. And you can even say, well, I think it'd be easier. It doesn't matter. She's going to do it the way she's going to do it. And sounds like Dale's mother was like that too. And then he mentioned pack saddles. If he's right, if you've ever been stung by one, then you'd remember it because it hurts. It's more of a, instead of a sting, like he said, wasp. It was hard for me to even say wasp because I say wasper. But instead of a sting like a wasper or a hornet or something, it's more of to me, like an electrical sting kind of thing that hangs on, electrical feeling. And I've certainly been stung by them and seen them in the corn like he was talking about, but sometimes they also get in my blueberry bushes, and I've been stung there before too. And then the end in there about the favorite places. Even if you didn't grow up and live in the same place for a long time like Dale did, wherever you're at, if you've been there, maybe you've not even been there a while, we as humans, we often stumble on or find places that we prefer around where we live. I mean, even people, I'm sure, in the city maybe find a certain bench they like, or a certain part of the park, or even just a certain street corner, whatever it may be. But I really loved how Dale described those places. Oh my goodness, I'd love to go see them and be in the cave with the creek coming across and forming the curtain, and I'd love to be where the big beech trees was. That sounded so pretty. I'd love that. Now, I'm really fortunate that I live in the same mountain holler that I grew up in. So I immediately, when I started reading that part of the book, places come to mind for me, the places that I like, and there's lots of them. But a few that come to mind is thinking about, since me and Matt's lived here almost 27 years, is up on the top of this ridge behind the camera there. It's very peaceful up there. It kind of feels like you're away from everything. So I like that, and the view's nice, all those kind of things. Thinking about up the creek, there's several places. There's kind of the first place is where our trail, if you watch any of our videos where we walk out the trail, sidles alongside the ridge out through there instead of going straight up, where it kind of comes out and lands and then in an old road bed, and just as you start up it, there's an old home place there. And Papa Wade told Pap that it was the oldest place, that when he come to this country, that was the oldest home place that whoever had told him about. It's just got a really beautiful feeling about it. It's kind of a little knoll, and then you can just see out to the creek, and kind of the road's right there, and kind of a flat out through there. It's really pretty and really a peaceful feeling. On up the creek, there's the pear trees. Again, a really old place. When Pap was a boy, there was still a few buildings standing. In my lifetime, there's not been. But if you look hard enough, you can see where their spring was lined with rock. And when Pap was a boy, there was still trees, fruit trees and fruit bushes there. Not in my lifetime, but hence the name, the pear trees. But that place is really special. And then even closer, just down at the creek right here by Pap's big garden, there's a great old big rock, like a shelf. and you can sit on it and put your feet in the creek if you wanted to. It was much larger, seemed like, when I was a girl, and I'd sit there. And just behind Steve's house, there's some beautiful sets of falls, little falls, for I don't know how many yards, 20 yards or something like that up through there. But even before you get to them, there's kind of a place, a swampy place with great old big rocks where a spring's coming out, and you got to kind of get through it before you get to the creek. And that's always been one of my favorite places. I can remember that place, well, all those places, long before Steve's house was there, you know, way back when I was a girl. So it's wonderful to think about those special places like Dale, you know, how he's recounting them and talking about them, and how the different ways they made him feel, from the place where he could play like he was an adventurer, you know, whatever it was he was playing, and then the place that was more reverent, like he just wanted to be very quiet, and then the place on the cliffs where he would do his thinking, go and sit and think things through. I really enjoy all that, and I could just picture it in my mind the way Dale described it. So I hope you enjoyed this part of the book. Please leave a comment and tell me what jumped out at you. And as always, I hope you'll drop back by next Friday, because we've got to see what happens next in Watermelon Hill.